Today, I'm going to try my very best to show you how to blend it like Beckham. So yeah, I polled this one on Twitter and quite a lot of you were interested in hearing about it. I wanted to give a little tutorial on wet blending, and I'm going to be real with you, it's going to be a little bit abstract. I will do my best to show you some practical examples, get you feeling comfortable. But wet blending is a process that's really, it's about feel. You know, you have to have the paint there on the model, on the brush, in your hands to really get a good sense of why it's doing what it's doing and how it's going to behave as you continue to apply it. So with that in mind, we're going to head to a few different bits of downcam footage here as I give you a few examples of some types of wet blending. But I want you to just bear in mind that a lot of this, you're really going to have to just give it a go. Just get stuck in. Let's get to the downcam. Okay, first off, we're going to talk about just a standard wet blend. So you can see here I've got some reasonably thick, this is thinned, but it's not super thin, black paint and white paint, and I'm just sort of smushing the two together. You will also notice here that I have the base colour of this already as the darkest colour of my wet blend. I think that's really important personally. But basically the technique that I'm using here is just to take paint that is not overly thinned to start out with as my darker colour, and then to take a thinner paint to use as my lighter colour to blend out of it. So there's just a little bit of difference in that usually when I'm trying to move the blend, when I'm trying to create a lot of movement in the blend, I use a thinner paint so that the paint that's already down is stronger. And when I'm trying to just kind of strengthen the blend, I'll go to a thicker paint so that it covers more. But it's basically just a case of working between the two paints. And that's why I said in the intro to this video that it's kind of an abstract concept, because a lot of how that wet blend is going to behave is going to be very different miniature to miniature. There's going to be a lot of changes in how the paint feels and how it applies and how it sits in certain textures and certain shapes. And so what you're really going to want to do is grab a miniature and start trying this, start just giving it a go. The main thing with this technique is that getting good at it really requires you to fail a few times first, because you've got to get used to just that feel of how the paint moves when it's being wet blended. So in this case you can see I've worked black to white. That's really just for illustrative purposes. Black and white are not the easiest colour pairing to blend together. They like to show each other's defects a lot, but it is very clear for you to be able to see. So I'm just going to blast that with the hairdryer now after I've worked it all up, and you can see the transitions in it are looking pretty nice and clean and smooth. It's quite a nice pretty wet blend. What I'm now going to do though with that is, just to give it a bit of clarity, I'm going to take a glaze or a wash of whatever my darkest colour was in the wet blend, and I'm going to knock that all over, and that's just, it's going to pull that texture back out more than anything. With wet blending you do lose a lot of the surface texture on the miniature. So we'll grab that back out with a quick wash, and then we'll dry it off again with the hairdryer. And then what I also like to do, just to help bring the texture back up, is I like to apply a few little edge highlights as well to my wet blends. So this is the other thing just to bear in mind with wet blending, is that it is not a standalone technique. There are very few surfaces that you'll just want to wet blend. However, if you knock in a wet blend and then add a wash over it just to kind of unify those colours a bit and bring in some texture, that's going to look really nice. And if you come in here with some edge highlights in a brighter colour, that's going to help pick out some of the texture, some of the shape of that miniature. So by combining wet blending with other techniques, we can do some really cool stuff that looks really pretty. Next I'm going to talk about loaded brush blending, and this is where we use a normally thinned paint and a thick paint. So you can see I'm just measuring these two out here, just checking their consistencies. And what we want to do is the darker colour of the blend, we want to fully load the brush with. We want that paint to be quite thin. We want it to be able to move freely. And then with our thicker, lighter colour in our blend, we just want a little dot on the end of the brush, just like that, you see. And what's going to happen, this is magic, you'll enjoy this. As we place it down and wiggle the brush, it's going to blend away. Now, this does work best for linear shapes, I will say that. It works a lot better for linear shapes. But as you can see, once you've got it down there, that loaded brush blend, you can then come in with the constituent colours that are in that blend, and you can start to, while the paint's wet, just kind of micromanage it a little bit. You know, so I wanted the kind of worn, mystical metal here. That's what I'm eventually going for. And I'm showing you one of the strengths to use in black and white here as well. So you can see the blend is super smooth, but I now want to start to introduce some texture to it. I want to kind of get a bit of light play going on. So now I'm just going to come back with the exact same colours that are represented in the blend, and I'm just going to add another little blend over the top first of all. That's just going to give me a bit more impact, and then I'm going to start to work that as a wet blend. So I've got a blend underneath to give me a base, but now I'm starting to try and work some texture into that blend. So the idea here is I'm just using the colours that were already present in my blend, keeping the white thick and the black thin so that they behave the same consistently, so I can predict their behaviour. And you see I'm just working them together like they were a really tiny small wet blend, just to start to tickle areas of that I'm not happy with and introduce some texture. I'll put another loaded brush blend on the front of the spearhead there, and again, sorry for the little bit of off camera. It's tough with things like this, you know, because you've really got to work fast, so you don't really get a chance to think about if you're properly in shot. I did pull it back in pretty quickly though, and I'm just doing exactly the same thing. I start off with the loaded brush blend, and then I start manually adding texture. Initially there, you see I slipped a little bit and I sort of blobbed some paint quite heavily onto that ridge. That actually ended up playing really nicely into creating some really sort of chunky textural highlights. So you can see I'm just using the black now to blend it back down a bit on one side, and they go from looking like these big heavy blobs to looking like these really nice little textural accent points. And this is where that idea of working backwards and forwards and, you know, really constantly staying on it while it's wet, because while it's wet it can be reworked and removed and those blends can be adjusted. Once it's dried out, you don't really have that option anymore. Now we're starting to just add some dry texture over the top, just with some little lines and dashes. I'll give you a good look at this now because I'm about to do something to it just to finish it off. So when you do a black and grey blend like this, or a black and white blend, you will often still want colour in it. So I'm just going to glaze over this with some Ethematic blue just to show you sort of an idea of something you could do with it. We go from having this kind of black and grey, not really sure what it is, when we hit this Ethematic blue and then give it a nice little zap with a hairdryer, we've got what looks like a kind of chipped, ancient, mystical spear tip, which I think is pretty sick, to be honest. I think that worked out quite cool. So that's loaded brush blending. The final thing I want to show you, this is actually a clip now from one of my recent streams. I do stream, twitch.tv/thatmrshy. And this is just me doing another traditional wet blend, but it's on a linear shape. So whereas we did that wing before where we had a lot of space to kind of wiggle around and move that paint, this is more on a linear shape, and it's also using some colours, so it just gives you a bit of an idea of how that looks with colours. You see we've got a really dark turquoise and then a really bright kind of yellowy green. You want colours that are quite far separated when you do your wet blends. You don't want colours that are really close to each other, simply because that's not going to put any drama into your wet blend. And the whole idea of doing a wet blend in the first place is you want a big, dramatic, flashy gradient that has a lot of pop to it. You can see how this blend looks when it's finished by the other parts on the miniature that I've already completed. But essentially all I'm doing here is just continuing to work light colours and moving upwards every time. So again, my dark turquoise was my thinner paint, my pale sort of greeny yellow is my lighter paint, and I'm just working upwards, working upwards, working upwards, working upwards, and constantly making sure that if that paint is wet and I need to move it, I get it moved while it's still wet, because as soon as it dries, I'm no longer going to be blending, I'm just going to be placing colour. Just take one final zap at that now. It is starting to dry at this point, but that's fine because we just need to hit the very, very top. And you can see because we're constantly moving in the same direction, it just builds up really nicely, really cleanly, really smoothly. We get something pretty. You see, I told you it was a bit abstract, but at least seeing someone do it, seeing that kind of thing happening before your eyes in real time, I think that sort of helps you get to grips with that idea of it just needing to be something that you get stuck in and have a go at. Now, I would recommend when you attempt your first few wet blends, maybe don't go black to white like I did, because it can be really, really hard to get clean whites in the top end. That's something that you sort of have to practice a bit, be willing to work at a bit. But it is also a very clear way to show it to you. I would recommend maybe trying like a dark blue to a mid blue or a red to an orange, something like that. And I'll tell you what, I would love it if you could tweet at me, show me some examples of your wet blending that you've attempted after watching this video. My Twitter handle is in the description of the video, so you can find it there. You can also find links to my other socials there if you want to, you know, get in touch and interact and do the whole engagement thing or whatever. I would love it if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel as well. That would really help me get seen. I will be back next week. So until then, folks, take care and happy painting.